webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be made available to all attendees following the session. We want this session to be informative and engaging, so please do use the chat function, share your comments, ask questions after the panelists are done, and just, engage as much as possible. We really hope you enjoy the session. Thank you once again for joining us, and over to you, Mathieu.
Thank you. Thank you, Abby. Good afternoon, good evening, everybody. As Abby said, I'm Mathieu Lamiaux. I'm a managing director with the Boston Consulting Group, leading our healthcare activities in Africa. Maybe just a bit of context before introducing the panelists. Africa, as you know, is facing a third wave with cases spreading more rapidly. Actually, the third wave is already higher than the previous one, with more than 250,000 confirmed cases every week, and that for several weeks. The pandemic is resurging in multiple African countries, combination of factors, including weak observance of public health measures, increased social interaction and movement, as well as the spread of the variants of concerns, are really powering the new surge. And yet the picture is mixed, because with just over 6 million cases, confirmed cases in Africa, and about 150,000 deaths reported, Africa represents something between 3 and 4% of the global burden, whereas its population represents 17% of the global population. So while things are worsening with that third wave, the things are not as bad as it was anticipated about a year and let's say 15 months ago. I remember a discussion in March last year, where people were really describing a catastrophic situation in Africa that, we haven't seen. I'm not saying that the situation is not bad, but some elements may explain the paradox. During the first wave, African governments responding very quickly to the pandemic with public health measures to prevent the spread of the virus. The relatively youth of the African population may be another advantage. In sub-Saharan Africa, only 3% of the population is above 65 years or older. By contrast, in the European Union, it's about 20%. 43% of the population is less than 15 years old in Africa, when it's only 17% in Europe. On the other hand, of course, the healthcare systems in many African countries were ill prepared for such a pandemic, with low numbers of healthcare workers, little capacity for providing healthcare to the severely ill. Low and middle income countries have limited resources to mitigate social and economic disruption created by the pandemic. And when it comes to vaccination, the picture there is far worse. It has been described as, vaccine access has been described as unequal and unfair, with just above 1% of the African population that has been fully vaccinated to date. So our intent today is not to perform a thorough analysis of the crisis, its history, its evolution, or the multiple solutions that we could think about, but really taking a specific angle. So the challenges and the lessons learned on the global COVID-19 vaccination drive, thinking about a number of actionable steps that could build healthcare resilience, as Abby said, and in particular, how to mobilize private capital, to support the deployment, but also the research and development of the African health ecosystem. But before we discuss the role of the private investment, the potential solution and potential public-private collaboration, I would like to introduce my distinguished panelists. So we have Natalie. Natalie is a partner with Actis, a private equity house. She's responsible for Actis investment in Tracker, Sigma Pension, Choreographed, and she continues to work on new deals across Southern Africa. We also have Dr. Egbe. Dr. Egbe is a founding partner at Anadach Group and a non-executive director at Medsaf. She used to work with the World Bank Institute, and she's a qualified medical doctor, leading a number of projects with global pharmaceutical companies, private equity funds, banks, and DFIs. And finally, Vivian. Vivian is the founder and CEO of Medsaf. Medsaf is a tech-enabled pharmaceutical platform that facilitates the movement of medication in Nigeria in order to increase access, quality, and affordability for Nigerian patients. So with that, I will start with a couple of questions for each of the panelists before we move to the Q&A. Natalie, is it fine if I start with you?
Yes, no problem. Thank you, Matthew.
Right. So in the AVCA report on private equity data tracker, it came that technology-enabled deals accounted for 55% of the total deal volume in 2020. Health tech being the most top picks for investors. You know, they're seeking to take advantage of market gaps and profit for opportunities arising from the pandemic. So in your opinion, you know, what role can digital innovation play in improving access to healthcare in sub-Saharan Africa?
Yeah, Matthew, thank you for that. I mean, I think before we answer the question, we need to take a step back and have a look at the states of healthcare systems in Africa. And I think we can all agree that the states, particularly the public sector healthcare systems, are in a state of disarray. I mean, hospitals are dilapidated, they are deteriorating. Often when you do go to these hospitals, the equipment isn't working. Healthcare workers have often, you know, doctors have left for greener pastures. They've moved to Canada, to the US, to the UK, and they're in high demand there. And those that are left behind are stretched. And just putting this all together, it results in a very unsatisfactory experience for patients that are accessing the healthcare. You know, and particularly for those that are based in rural areas, they're having to walk, you know, or take very expensive transport to get to a clinic. The clinic is often run down or dilapidated. They're spending hours in a queue waiting to get served. And when they do, often the doctors don't have the equipment to do a proper diagnosis. So the whole experience is frankly, you know, it's unacceptable. And the problem is, I don't think that there is a solution to this if you just think about fixing this in a traditional way. And the reason is because there is no money. You know, governments on the continent were already stretched before COVID. And post-COVID, the coffers are completely empty. And they're going to continue to be under strain as vaccines need to be procured and rolled out. And in the private sector, you know, if we're looking again at the traditional way of rolling out healthcare, because the end user or the end patient does not have the financial means, the return on investment isn't there to attract a lot of private capital to the sector. So I think, you know, trying to solve the healthcare solution on the continent using traditional, you know, the kind of traditional way of doing this is not going to work. But there is good news. And the good news is it's technology and innovative solutions around technology. And there are so many exciting startups in every sphere of the healthcare the system on the continent. And, you know, and what these startups are doing is they are improving access and they're improving quality. And access there's two aspects to access. The one is cost. So technology lowers the cost of access, but there's also physical access as well, where now you're able to have diagnosis and treatment done virtually. So you're able to sit in your home, you know, in a rural area and be able to plug into a doctor, you know, that knows exactly what they're doing, who's got the diagnosis through some kind of technology, and that is very exciting. And if you map the health value chain, you know, all the way starting from diagnosis all the way through to patient recovery and everything in between that, whether it be supply chain management, pharmaceuticals, you know, pharmacy management, telemedicine, health, you know, medical, insurtech. In each of these, there are some great companies that are doing great things to solve the problems. And I mean, let me just give you some examples of this just to really bring it to life. And starting at the beginning, there's a business in Kenya called Ilara Health, which has developed some very interesting products around diagnostics. So they've partnered with companies. They use robotics and artificial intelligence. They then have developed their own devices and their own tech platform, and they're able to give these devices to doctors in a cost-effective way with the funding model behind it. So doctors can now sit in a rural clinic and have a handheld device that they're able to do, you know, scans for pregnant mothers, for example. You know, another great example is patient records and information exchange. I mean, here in South Africa, we probably have the most sophisticated private healthcare system. And anybody, you know, who's gone to a private doctor in South Africa will know. When you walk in there, the first thing they give you is a clipboard and a pencil and a bunch of papers that you've got to fill out. And the next time you go back, they give you that same clipboard with the same paperwork and a pencil and an eraser so that you can rub out, you know, if anything's changed. And this is in a relatively sophisticated healthcare system. So, being able to bring digital records and put that in place, and to be able to share that between doctors, and Health Tag in Egypt is an example of a business that has done this. And there's everything, from diagnosis and drones delivering blood, pharmaceutical supply chain solutions. M-Pharma and Field Intelligence have developed some very innovative solutions around the pharma value chain to make sure that pharmaceuticals are in the right place at the right time for the right patients, and that the product is authentic and not forged. So as you can see, there's a huge amount of some really cool tech that I think is really solving the problems of the continent. And because they are solving that problem, there is a demand for that product, and therefore private capital will follow. And the return on investment is there, and therefore private capital will follow, and it will be able to bring that access and reduce the cost, for patients.
And would you say that, during this crisis, what has been I would say the attitude, the mindset of the investors? Did they see an opportunity and decide to accelerate the investment, saying the needs are there, and as we often say, in a crisis, there are always opportunities? Or, are they stepping back and say, well, actually, the systems, where the systems that you described earlier, and, they're such in bad conditions that, the ROI, will be very difficult,
Yeah. So Matthew, I think yeah, certainly. At the beginning of this crisis, I think everybody just, kind of went into it eyes wide open, and capital definitely dried up. I think all private equity and venture capital on the continent look inward. They all focused on their own portfolio, and funders also held onto their cash as well, because they wanted to make sure that if there was a problem, that they were able to support their portfolio companies. That has passed. And I think what the pandemic has done is it has shown us a new way of working. It has accelerated what was offline onto online. It's accelerated digital applications, and it's accelerated the people have been forced to be able to think innovatively, because you can't all be rushing to the hospitals because the hospitals were overloaded. So for medical and health technology, COVID has been a good thing. Obviously COVID hasn't been a good thing in general, but for that specifically, it has accelerated what was already a trend. And the capital is following, and it's coming back to the continent.
All right, thank you. Dr. Egbe, may I turn to you to talk, just stepping back, not specifically looking at the investors and the investment, but more looking at the role of the private sector. I have been working in Africa for more than almost 30 years now, starting in development, prior to working with BCG. I used to work with the French Development Agency. And I always felt, the tension between the public and the private sector, with, very often governments, not fully recognizing the role of the private sector. But, we know that today, whether you see it from a funding perspective with, most of the expenditure being out of pocket, at least clearly north of 50%, but also healthcare provision, being done by the private sector at nearly 50% in many African countries. Would you say that the crisis we're going through and the pandemic, will accelerate the role of the private sector, or do you think it will slow down because the governments, will want to take some control over the sector?
Thanks, Matthew. This is a very interesting question. And like you said, we spent a lot of time thinking about it. And when we started Anadach to focus on the private sector 10 years ago, everybody thought we were crazy, where is the private sector in health? I think one thing which, to remember, like you always say, there are 54 African countries who have different sort of financial structures. And you can sort of divide them maybe into three. And so you have countries where the public sector is extremely important, and then you have companies where you have a mix, and then you have companies where the private sector is, is big. And I think the government approach actually in each of the various, how you categorize them, also differs. So if we take the first sort of category, like if you look at Nigeria, for example, where, government, both federal and state, 20-25% of expenditure, and 70% is private. Maybe the donors 5 to 8%, depending on the year. I mean, the private sector is big, and it's taking the government some time, I think, to understand the role or potential role of the private sector, either on the financing side or the delivery side. It's quite, I think both sides are different. So in Nigeria, where you have a lot of large out-of-pocket financing, the government has been trying to encourage insurance as a way to sort of pull financing together. So far, the results are mixed. And so what happened during COVID was, I think one, it was actually good for insurance. All of a sudden, people felt who had any type of insurance were actually happy. So it actually helped the demand for health insurance, from a very low level that, if they were severely ill, they could get somewhere. The second was that the government sort of immediately responded with COVID, and most of the state governments responded. And then they went to the business coalition of COVID, where you had large businesses that put money. Some of them sort of set up centers. But in many ways, it has been quite ad hoc. I mean, there's been the advocacy group in Nigeria, the Health Federation of Nigeria, that's trying to sort of have conversations. But I think, so that's on the, sort of delivery side. But on COVID in particular, which is probably the largest, major financial expenditure of a lifetime, I'm not sure most countries in Africa have really stood back and looked at what their financing structure is and how can they finance, COVID care for the patients in the longer run. What we know now that is clear from either, the US or UK or Israel that's heavily vaccinated is that COVID is not a one shot. It's not a 1 year. This is not a 1 year issue. This is a significant long-term issue. So how are the countries going to deal with it? And from where I sit, I see only maybe two, maybe the Moroccans and I think Rwandese, maybe Ghanaians, a couple of countries are thinking about this systematically. COVAX has agreed to finance 20% of the vaccines. What we have seen in other countries is that to get COVID into a controllable level, you need to have at least 50-60% of the population covered. At this point, other than 1 or 2 countries, I cannot see a clear pathway to the 60%. And even South Africa, which probably spends the highest amount of money on healthcare on the continent, the pathway to 60%, I don't think is clear. I do not think there's a pathway in any African country without thinking about the role of the private sector, either in financing or in delivery. And so that's one. And so, I mean, there have been very interesting examples across the continent. I mean, Ghana, you mentioned Mfama. Ghana has used Mfama very aggressively in sort of, trying to figure out their vaccine gap. The Moroccans have used the whole government approach, not just the private sector, all their embassies, in Europe, everybody knows their number one goal is to get vaccines, and so I think that whole government approach that includes sort of the private sector into the conversation is critical. I also agree with Natalie that the role of technology has been amazing. I mean, during this crisis, we ran an event with IFC, trying to look at innovations, tech innovations in COVID. And it was amazing. You had things from AI in Egypt, looking for AI because of the shortage of radiologists across the continent, to various folks doing telemedicine. I mean, Nigeria, Lagos State actually started a public sector sort of telemedicine program. And, so, I mean, you mentioned drones. So on innovation, on the tech innovation, it was very interesting. But I think the big issue now is how do you get to scale? And how can you use this sort of existing infrastructure on the ground? And how can you use this technology to make the existing infrastructure work better? I mean, if you think is what's happening in other richer countries where there's been telemedicine, many of the larger health organizations have taken this innovation to also improve the way they actually do, they do business. And I think it's very important. I mean, in many countries, the governments have spent years, whether or not they work efficiently, depending on where you are, really is how can you use this technology to make it more effective? Mm-hmm. I personally am very hopeful on technology, given what Africa has done in the fintech space, you know, where many African countries are major global players in the fintech space. I think some of those skills are transferable and can address sort of issues. But I think for skill, you know, we need to look at how does it link to existing infrastructure, you know, on the ground, you know, on the ground. So, yeah, but how does it link to exist?
You're on mute, Egbe.
Okay.
I'd like to get back to one point, you know, very important, you know, when you say that, you know, COVAX, you know, at best, you know, will cover, you know, 20% of the needs for vaccine, that governments, you know, may not have the fiscal space to pay for the 80%, and that the private sector could play a role. What did you mean by that? You know, I mean, where could the private sector, you know, play a role in procuring and distributing the vaccines?
I suspect in the whole pharmaceutical chain. So we can talk about from manufacturing. As you know, there's a lot of conversations, and at last count, at least 10 or 12 African countries have indicated interest in manufacturing vaccines. I suspect the South Africans are the most advanced because, first of all, they actually had a manufacturing basis. And so maybe this year, I mean, the initial conversations had been Q3, but I don't think it's going to happen in Q3. Even for the finish and fill. So I think manufacturing is one, and we need to think about some sort of regional approaches and the AU. The second is the issue of purchase. There has been, I think the AU and the African regional entities have sort of responded, you know, to the issue of purchasing and trying to sort of conglomerate demand. I think it's also interesting for Africa to look at what's happening in Asia. So if you look at other countries that have relatively low vaccine rates, whether it's the Philippines or Indonesia or Thailand or Pakistan, these are all countries that have decided to actually allow the private sector to enter a controlled purchasing space, because their argument is that while, you know, the government will continue to look for COVID, it's important for business and the economy to return back to normal, especially in many countries where COVID has been predominantly an urban disease. Employers are more likely to be able to address sort of urban issues. So I think that's something some of the African countries might want to look at what some of the Asian countries are also doing in this space. And I think the third is actually an issue of distribution. In many countries, the supply chain is run by the private sector. I know we have Vivian going to talk to us about innovation on distribution and really using some of the technology Natalie was talking about. I think a lot of that will come from the private sector. And the other bit is actually putting the jabs in people's arms. So far, in most African countries, it has been government people actually injecting people. Now, at 1% of the population, this probably makes sense. But as you mentioned earlier, where you have the private sector delivering 50 or 60% of the delivery, and people trust their health providers, whether they're doctors, nurses, midwives, polio vaccinators, you know, it seems a great shame to cut out, you know, a large chunk of your delivery network, especially if you need to vaccinate people very fast. And so I think the question, you know, people often say many governments are very worried about, oh, you know, the private sector will come and will affect equity. I think the big issue in my view is that people should not pay for COVID vaccine at the point of delivery. However, one needs to think about a pluralistic approach to financing. So even if the patient does not pay for the COVID vaccine directly, it does not mean their insurance cannot pay, because so far most African countries, even people that have insurance, they're not allowing the insurance to pay for the vaccines. You know, so I really think that a pluralistic approach by many governments will be necessary to get from 20 to 60%. Right. As you've said, that 40%, there's apparently no fiscal space. And in many countries, it will probably require double the healthcare budget, doubling the healthcare budget, so they can do that from a government perspective.
Thank you, Egbe. You touch upon the distribution, which I think is a very important topic. And as you said, you know, we are lucky to have Vivian with us. So Vivian, you created a Medsaf platform in 2014, if I'm not mistaken. And your objective, was to provide access, quality, affordability in the distribution. I'm sure you've learned a lot over the last 7 years. Are there any specific learnings that you would like to apply to the distribution of vaccine in the fight against the COVID-19?
Hi, how are you guys doing? Thank you for allowing me to be here with you guys. Yeah, so I mean, I feel like, Medsaf is a platform, we're using data analytics and various products to help hospitals and pharmacies get access to better quality medications at better prices, right? And what we're really doing is we're taking on the burden of working out the myriad of supply chain problems and challenges that impact the pharmaceutical industry on a daily basis. We're talking about, from a macro level, you can talk about price fluctuations, FX issues, ports, the ports system, logistics, transportation, storage, access to capital, all of these are problems that we've created a really sticky service to help hospitals and pharmacies really get the best out of their medication needs and be able to kind of give good patient care. And so if you think about COVID-19 and what it actually did on ground, is it basically exacerbated all of the issues, right, that are actually impacting the pharmaceutical industry in countries like Nigeria. But what it did for a company like Medsaf is it was like our use case, right? I mean, it's like our use case is here, right? So all of your traditional, ways of procuring medications, open drug markets, for example, and what we always say is the open drug markets and kind of unofficial places to purchase medications, those are our biggest competitors. So I know you've mentioned, some of our, competitors like, M-Pharma or whatever. I mean, the reality is on the ground, what we're really going up against is traditional distribution. And so since 2017, we've been training and onboarding hospitals and pharmacies. We have over 250, and we've been training them on how to use technology to improve, their procurement. And so we've always sold vaccines. We've always sold masks. We've always sold everything that is necessary for COVID-19. We've been working with those products since 2017. And so, what I would say from an investment perspective or for looking at in Africa or Nigeria or, looking at the healthcare is really just digging down deep into the operators who actually have entrenched and built, that the strong framework to deal with these issues in the proper way, because what we did see last year is that because of COVID-19 kind of gets a little bit politicized and it's kind of bringing a lot of attention to the healthcare space, which is good, right? We can turn this into a positive, right? There's a lot of negative things have happened because of COVID-19 and the way that it's kind of just, really just been destructive to people worldwide. But, I'd say that the silver lining is that, people are paying attention to healthcare. But that being said, because it's maybe harder to do due diligence or it's harder to actually get on the ground and actually see what's going on, we definitely saw a lot of people kind of, portraying themselves as potentially being able to do what they're not actually able to do on the ground. We saw a lot of companies, start to try to, or a lot of people just try to get in the game, right? It was such an interesting experience last year when everyone started to decide that they were going to get into N95 masks. And a lot of them are still stuck with the stock today, right? So I think, you know, what it is for us is just about strengthening and doubling down on what we know is the right thing to do that we've been working on since 2017. You know, we are building the technology around, you know, a lot of these problems to facilitate it, make it easier for us to scale, not only across Nigeria, but across Africa. And we are a strong, solid company if you kick beneath the tires. And we can go head to head with a lot of the traditional pharmaceutical distribution outfits here in Nigeria. And I think from an investment perspective, that's really what it's about, because, you know, for example, with cold chain products, it's so important not to break the chain, right? It's so important to, you know, be able to have the information on where it came from, you know, how it was stored, you know, how, you know, who it's getting to and why it needs to get somewhere within, you know, at any given moment in time. I mean, we're kind of dealing with you know, the pharmaceutical industry is quite complex. You know, in Medsaf, you know, we sell thousands, over hundreds of thousands of different SKUs on a monthly basis. And we've got to get those medications and get them across the country within 48 to 72 hours. So it can be quite complex. And there's a lot of ways to, you know, there's a lot of ways to kind of mess things up, especially if you're talking about cold chain products. So for the COVID-19 vaccine, I worry a little bit. I hope that, you know, that it does open up to the private sector, but I hope that there's a vetting system that's based on actual, you know, execution and reality. Of capabilities, you know, so those are some of the things that I would say. But overall, what Medsaf has done, you know, we import, you know, we work with COVID-19 related consumables. We're supporting the COVID-19 ecosystem, just like we've always have. And we're just kind of doubling down on that and creating transparency around that. We have an app for cold chain products coming out in our third quarter. You know, that would be amazing for COVID-19 products. So
Vivian, sorry to interrupt, but, you know, for me, what I'd like to understand is, you know, this, I guess the scale up, you know, especially in a country like Nigeria, you know, being able to scale up, you know, in the urban area, you know, where you probably have, you know, your biggest base of customer, but being able to scale up to the entirety of the country, you know, assuming that, you know, in the coming month, you know, the doses will be made available and, you know, you could have the opportunity to distribute the vaccines throughout Nigeria, potentially beyond Nigeria. But if we stick to Nigeria, do you believe that public-private partnership, you know, would be part of the solution, you know, which would help you, you know, to have the scale, you know, access a broader market, but also get the control that, you know, you were talking about, assuming that, you know, the government, you know, could play that role of stewardship. Do you think that's a path?
Absolutely, and we're already preparing for it. So, you know, from the perspective of, you know, ensuring that we have the right materials, the right equipment, but also I think that, you know, if you think about it from a technological perspective, and how can you create, you know, these distributed warehouses that are controlled across the country, using technology to tie them all together, you know, that is what Medsaf does. You know, so if the government came calling, you know, we'd be able to implement a system like that where they could understand where all of their COVID-19 vaccines are at any given moment in time. And we could even track it back to the patient and even get patient feedback, you know, and create this kind of controlled ecosystem of, you know, understanding of where these vaccines are, you know, how they're, you know, how they're being handled, and who they get dispensed to and why. You know, these are all things that we had to figure out building Medsaf. So I definitely think that since this is our focus, you know, we launched the company in 2017, but, you know, this is our focus. You know, it's what we do all day. It's what we do every day. You know, I think that we could really be helpful to government to execute on this if we're given the chance to do so.
Right. Thank you. And maybe one last question. You know, Natalie mentioned the fact that, you know, funds will be, capital will be available, and, you know, that investors, you know, are very interested in healthcare and digital solution. You know, is that your experience? You know, I mean, as the CEO of a company working in healthcare, digitally enabled, you know, I mean, Do you have many investors knocking on your door, or is that still difficult to attract funds?
I definitely, so in the beginning of 2017, nobody was talking about investments. Nobody was talking about investment in healthcare. You know, I was scraping and really working hard to raise money. You know, we're just rounding up a pre-Series A round. We had to start raising in the middle of the pandemic. So that was, you know, really an interesting experience as an entrepreneur. You know, but we've come out on top. So we're about to close that. We'll probably end up with like 1.6 million plus. We've raised over 3 million to date for Medsaf. Once we close that, we're like a couple days away. Right. So the story ended up well, right? I think that, you know, for Medsaf, but I think that also speaks to the fact that we've been executing on the ground for quite a while. You know, we have a lot of feedback from, you know, hospitals, some of the largest hospitals in the country use Medsaf monthly. You know, so I think that, you know, we had a good chance. I think for the investors, they're really going to need to understand, you know, how to really kind of read between the lines and do the due diligence to actually know who's real and who's not. That's what I think is going to be their issue, because there's a huge rush to healthcare. Everyone wants to solve it, but this is one of the most complicated, if you think about education, and then I think education and healthcare, right? Two of the most complicated issues. This is not a fintech company that is been built off of the back of you know, the telecoms, where everything is like in a neat little package. This is a messy issue. So investors who are looking to get into healthcare need to roll their sleeves up and get into it, because, you know, it's quite complicated. But I love systems. I love solving problems, and so that's why I'm still, you know, having fun at Medsaf. You know, but this is a problem. So that's what I would just kind of throw out there. But I wish everyone luck. I would say that, yeah, people are coming to invest, but it's complicated. So there are probably, you know, a lot of different stories out there of success, you know, because it's not so simple. Yeah.
Thank you, Vivian. Natalie, as an investor, you know, would you say you have the same difficulty, you know, when you're, you know, I mean, can you do due diligences the way you used to do them? Are you struggling these days, you know, to get, you know, the type of information, you know, you would like to have before making an investment?
Yeah, and as a Mathieu, absolutely, that has changed completely. And you know, I think on the former point around how we do due diligence, I think that's actually that has changed for the better. I think the pandemic has actually has made it a lot more efficient as to how we do due diligence. I mean, you know, pre-COVID, we would normally, you know, have to block out an entire week and get all the advisors lined up, and you'd be flying the entire deal team and the tax consultants and the lawyers and the, you know, accountants to the head office of the portfolio company, and then spending a week there in management presentations. I think that's all gone. I mean, I think that has all moved online now. It's all virtual, it's Zoom meetings. So that kind of, I'm going to use the word tick box due diligence. I don't think people will travel for that anymore. That will be done virtually in Zoom, you know, the way that we're communicating now. Obviously, the aspects of that which is negative is that you don't have that human interaction and relationships, and being able to understand the entrepreneur that you're backing, and then for them also to get comfortable with you. Doing that over Zoom is difficult. So that is going to be important, that we bring that element of it back. And that is the difficulty at the moment. You know, but saying that, I mean, I've just closed a transaction this week where sold a big business, and I haven't met the buyer. I mean, you know, I've met them on Zoom, but I physically have never met them, and I probably never will. You know, which is quite strange. We normally used to spend hours, you know, in a physical room trying to negotiate an SPA, and that was all done virtually. I think the one negative that has come out of this whole COVID process is how to value companies. You know, what is sustainable profitability? Because the world is completely turned upside down. I mean, obviously last year was an anomaly, and frankly this year is continuing to be an anomaly. And what we're seeing is businesses have responded differently. Some of our businesses have actually bounced back better. I mean, they're more profitable than they were in 2019. And then the buyer's going, well, is this real? Is this just a catch up from 2020? Or is this actually a fundamental shift in the market? So to actually price what is sustainable profitability is very difficult. And because of that, deals are taking longer, because due diligence is taking longer, because the buyers want to get comfort around that point. They're often introducing complex kind of earn-out structures because they're not confident on the profitability and on the sustainable earnings. So that has definitely rocked the way that, the kind of the normal deal-making process. And I suspect that will be with us for the next 4 or 5 years, because people will often look at the history to determine, what the future is, and you just can't rely on the history, until we kind of, get through to 3 or 4 normal years. So that has certainly disrupted the due diligence process quite a bit.
Thank you, Natalie. I think it's now time for Q&A, and we already have a number of questions. Egbe, Vivian, Natalie, you can probably see them in the Q&A. Maybe let me start with the first one. What is your view on the recent news about DFIs providing funding to support COVID vaccine manufacturing capabilities in Africa? Should we be excited about this, or are there better use of funding? So again, the question is on manufacturing, not procurement. Does one of you want to jump in?
I can just add.
Okay.
I was going to say, look, if money is coming in for vaccine development, I think that's great. As long as the entrepreneurs or the businesses can figure out how to flip that investment into covering more, right? Just getting the most out of it. So, if COVID-19 vaccine development has now kind of opened up a new way to look at, HIV vaccines for, diseases that we just haven't even had vaccines for, right? And so we'd love to see that happen in Africa, where, they're really just able to take, this investment and make it, cookie cutter, so that it can actually, actually do a lot more. That's all I would hope for vaccine investment.
All right. Egbe, do you wanted to jump on this one as well?
Yeah, I did. I think it depends on who the money is going to and the countries. I mean, what we've been hearing, most of the conversations have not been with entrepreneurs. We've been hearing the conversations at the level of government or public-private partnerships. And in my view, personally, I think there is probably a capacity limitation of how many manufacturing plants you can have for COVID vaccines in Africa. But saying that, there are lots of different areas of the pharmaceutical sector that supports COVID that may need support. I mean, from things like syringes or needles or medical oxygen or all the other kind of things that you need to support good COVID care that would also be helpful to other care. And the other thing I also think is also thinking about what are sort of African strengths. I do think that increasingly during COVID, many African countries have developed biotechnology strengths. For example, the virus in South Africa was first grown in South African labs and replicated in South African labs before elsewhere. And so I really think also building on Africa's strengths, I think in biotechnology, or I know someone mentioned fintech, but some of the big data analyses, all those kinds of strengths from fintech also have a play in healthcare. So in my view, it will be interesting if the funds are not just used to manufacture old type pharmaceutical vaccine manufacturing, but being used, like you said, in a very innovative manner to address issues related to COVID. But of course, most importantly, taking the markets and, like you said, the entrepreneurs into account. Because if not, it will be another white elephant. And God knows there are many white elephants all over Africa.
And actually, that's interesting. And I would like to build on the question from Francisca. Where so the short-term priority, could be, we need to procure the vaccines because, building a manufacturing site, is great, but the reality is, it's probably going to take, I think the most aggressive plan that I have seen is first production in 2024. I'm not talking about fill and finish, but for real production, we're talking about production, in 3 years from now, which honestly is already pretty aggressive. And investing in biotech, investing in research, may probably lead us, probably another 5 years behind that. So my question, again, building on Francisca's question is, how could governments, investors, entrepreneurs, large companies, balance, those different timeframes? How do you answer the short-term needs, of getting people vaccinated while building the independence, with your own manufacturing facilities, and also preparing the future, with investment, when we only have, a fixed amount, to invest? How do you balance, those 3 time horizons?
Mathieu, I mean, I think that, both Vivian and Egbe brought this point up. If all that we're doing is trying to build a factory that's going to do COVID vaccines, that's absolutely the wrong answer, because I just think that would be a complete waste of money. I mean, rather take that money and procure it. However, if we are building a factory or putting in some kind of facility that has got longevity for whatever it is that they can do with that facility, that's good news. So, I think any investor would be very happy to put money behind something if they can see that there's a return on investment beyond just the short-term need for COVID. So that for me would be key. If the facility can only do COVID, I would personally not build it and rather go and rather use the money to procure.
Okay. I think, unfortunately, Mathieu, the answer to your question is all 3 things need to happen at the same time. That's the real unfortunate answer, because many African countries have to make sure, and they owe it to their people to plan to make sure they're not in the same position they were, last year, when even countries are running out of aspirin, basic medical commodities. I mean, I think many African countries owe it to their people to make sure that, they're not in that situation. And I mean, people are mentioning, how do you also at the same time, make sure that you are also purchasing vaccines, which is the here and now. And I agree with you. Even the finish and fill is not ready. So, what do you do now? And it's also different types of money. I don't think the guys who are investing in vaccine manufacturing and in Vivian are the same people who are going to pay for vaccines. For
the vaccines themselves, I agree.
Directly. So it's really, I think, all at the same time. But I think the countries need to look at their domestic resources, that how do they use their domestic resources effectively? Because I think one thing that's also become clear, and not just in Africa, in many countries, people underestimated the cost of vaccinating COVID patients. And if you even look in more developed countries, like in the US, like, for example, at 50-something% nationally, now you have states who have much lower. So you have to spend more resources trying to deal with COVID hesitancy, getting issues, and so if you look at the per cost, for delivering a COVID vaccine, it obviously was underestimated at the basis. And so when you think of many African countries that have limited fiscal space, so it's not just purchasing the vaccines, but even the ability to get the vaccines effectively into people in the shortest possible time, I think is a major challenge in the here and now. And I think the private sector can play an important role, both in the, in the longer term, but I think in the immediate term.
Yeah.
I mean, Mathieu, if I may just add something, and I certainly don't want to diminish the importance of getting the vaccines rolled out in Africa, because I mean, we are at a snail's pace, not even compared to the rest of the world. But saying that, and it's the point that you made right at the beginning of this conversation, our young population will be our savior. I mean, if you have a look at the pyramids, I mean, we've all seen it, right? Africa's pyramid looks like this, and the rest of the world looks like this. And I mean, the stat that you used, I mean, I think it's 6% of our population on the continent is above the age of 60. So more than 90% is below that age, and that's they're less susceptible. And obviously, it gets less and less, but a big portion, more than 2/3 of our population is below the age of 30. And we've seen that the virus is not that, does not have such a dramatic impact on them. I'm not trying to, as I say, I don't want to diminish the importance of the vaccine, but it is less important than it would be in a country that has got an aging population. It's still important. I mean, it's still very important. And I think for for business confidence and consumer confidence, you know, being vaccinated, I think, gives people that confidence and gives business confidence to kind of move on. And I've seen it, you know, like people come bouncing into an office, you know, being vaccinated, and they just wouldn't come in before. So it is important, but we must just always just bear that in mind, this perspective around the age of our population.
Yeah, no, I fully agree with you. You know, I mean, one of the issues though is, you know, the development of variants. And, you know, and we've seen with the Delta variant, you know, if the virus is circulating, you know, the likelihood that, you know, we get one, you know, that is more nasty, and potentially, you know, that has an impact on the young population, which obviously, you know, is a doom scenario, and, you know, something we don't want to see happening. But I guess, you know, that's where, you know, people have been. I remember, you know, and you probably remember a year and something ago, you know, I mean, some people saying, well, you know, I mean, just let the virus circulate, you know, and, you know, it will happen what happens, and, you know, we just need to protect, you know, our elderly people, and it's going to be fine. Unfortunately, you know, we've seen the variants. So for me, that's the limitation. So, you know, we're probably going to have to find a solution here. There's still a lot of questions coming in. You know, there's one question on the role of insurance companies. The question is, what role can insurance companies that provide healthcare insurance play in creating capacity for healthcare services in the context where most governments are looking to create funding models for universal health access funding models? So, you know, I mean, how do we balance, you know, in the context of COVID, the role of the private insurance and the role of universal health coverage?
Okay. I think, I mean, in many countries, I mean, because of the conversations behind UHC, there's been an increase in social health insurance. And I think, like I said, in some countries, actually the COVID has been a positive issue for health insurance. You know, in case you lose your job, you have health care. And one of the, depending on how you see it, but positive sides of COVID was the complete collapse of medical tourism. You know? So all the middle income or upper middle income people that used to jet out, the one thing was no country was accepting people, you know, with COVID. And so I think that all that is a positive environment for insurance. And I think that's one of the things I'm putting squarely on the table for the African governments. I have not really heard of any government really thinking about how they're using their insurance programs to, at least for people who are covered by insurance. You know, maybe that will reduce the regulatory burden. And I'm interested to hear from Natalie. I don't know what the South Africans, you know, are doing, you know, regarding insurance, because many other countries, other richer countries that have insurance programs are at least making sure that the insurance is paying for part of COVID, and then the government is paying for people who are not insured. And I mean, that's what you're seeing in other countries, in Europe, in the US, in, you know, in Asia, you know, some sort of mixed approach. And I really think that, you know, some sort of mixed approach, you know, is the way to go. And the other reason why insurance is important is that, at least for the limited numbers of people they cover, I mean, which varies. I mean, in Rwanda, you're having, you know, 30, 40%, you know, Ghana, maybe 25, or Kenya, maybe 20. At least for those people, the insurance have good information about them. They have their health history. They can follow up with them if there were any issues, you know. So I think it's actually, you know, a resource on the table that, in my view, is being underutilized in the COVID pandemic across Africa. And I just want to say one thing to Natalie. Natalie, last year I would have agreed with you completely on the pyramid. But given what happened in India and the Delta variant, and when you look at the incidence of COVID now, even in highly vaccinated populations, what is happening in the young population? Like in the US, the fastest growing COVID age is between 12 and 30, you know. So, I mean, people who are unvaccinated are now ending up in hospital. So I would have agreed with you completely. But as long as you have large unvaccinated people, new variants are going to happen.
Thank you, Egbe. I'm conscious about time, and I promised to Abby that I would give her back the floor, you know, a few minutes before the top of the hour, and it's now. So Vivian, Egbe, Natalie, thank you very much for your contribution to this panel. And Abby, back to you. And it sounds like Abby is not back. Okay, here she is. And you're on mute, Abby.
Thank you. Thank you, Egbe. Thank you, Natalie, and thank you, Vivian. A really great, insightful, and very thought-provoking conversation. So thank you very much to our panelists, and thank you to those that joined us today. If I circle back to the question we asked ourselves at the start of the conversation, which is what role can the private sector play in addressing, health systems and also in accelerating the deployment of the vaccine. And I think we can agree from that conversation that there is a very wide role that the private sector can play, not limited to private sector being the investors in the healthcare sector, as Natalie talked about, and the role there, and the ample opportunity to invest across the value chain of the sector. Also, the private sector are really, they can play a key role as innovative disruptors in the sector, and all of the panelists have talked about all the disruptive innovation we're seeing in the healthcare sector as well, and the role of technology, which is really important. And our data also shows, our recently released VC report shows that 90% of all of the deals in 2020 were technology or technology-enabled deals, and that includes health tech as well. So that's really key. So, and finally, we talked about, controversially, if I might add, we talked about the path forward in terms of building Africa's manufacturing capacity, for not just the vaccines alone, but manufacturing capacity in general. So all the points were very salient, and like I said, very thought-provoking. You can carry on the conversation on the AVCA platform, which we recently launched last week as well. And if you want to learn more about what AVCA is doing and how we're tracking deals in the healthcare space, we also released a report, a healthcare snapshot report, which you can find on our website. So thank you so much to all the panelists. Thank you all for joining, and please do carry on the conversation across various mediums. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone.
Thanks everybody. Thanks Abby, thanks Matthew.
Thanks everyone, bye.
Thank you.